Welcome back to Propology 101. We are going to be finishing off the original trilogy DH-17s. Now, we're going to notice going through this that the Return of the Jedi DH-17 is a lot less crunchy than the earlier versions. The Return of the Jedi DH-17 is very much like, and basically, I would imagine, its design is inspired by the Empire Strikes Back design. It's pretty much Greebly for Greebly, a match, with a few small differences and then one major difference. As the A New Hope and the Empire Strikes Backs were both based on the Sterling submachine gun, the Return of the Jedi is not based on the Sterling machine gun. It is actually based on the Model Gun Corporation all-metal replica of the C1. The C1 is a Canadian submachine gun based on the Sterling submachine gun. Basically what it is, it's a cheap version of the Sterling. It's all stamped sheet metal parts. It was designed to be manufactured much more cheaply than the Sterling was. So instead of using cast and machined parts like the Sterling does, the C1 is a dumbed down version of the Sterling that was made by the Canadian government. So since the Return of the Jedi is based on a replica gun and not a real gun, it is made by a company called Model Gun Corporation. The Model Gun Corporation created replica firearms that kind of filled the gun nut itch in a lot of people. They were able to be broken down into individual parts. They had slide mechanisms. You could dry fire them. You could do all kinds of things like that. And then as they progressed, they added a blank firing ability to these replica firearms. Now, they made a ton of revolvers. They also made some semi-automatic pistols that were blank firing, and they made some machine guns. They made Thompson submachine guns, and they made this particular version, which is the Sterling version. The Model Gun Corporation Sterling, we'll just call it the Model Gun Corporation Sterling. If you notice, it had to be cut down to facilitate being turned into a DH-17. So the first off they did, they cut the front and the back off. They removed the barrel. They also removed the folding stock. And when they removed the folding stock, they put a little cover plate and riveted on the bottom. That covers up where the Sterling folding stock used to mount. The rear cap, the pieces that hold it on are no longer there, so they reattached the rear cap with rivets. Also, the release was cut, and that's welded onto the receiver tube, so I think they just made a standing Greebly for that spot. The bolt, the Model Gun Corporation bolt, is in place, but it doesn't have a charging lever. But none of the other DH-17s had charging levers, so it was obviously left off. Even though there's a hole there, they never planned to actually have the charging lever there. Since this is a real receiver tube, unlike the other two versions that the receiver tubes were just mock-ups of original tubes, this one still has the charging lever slot, which is like an artifact of what would have been there if they'd used real Sterling tubes, which we obviously know they did not. Moving on, we have our single point scope. We've talked about the single point scope a lot, but this one's a little bit different. If you notice very closely, they removed the dust covers for the adjusters. You'll also notice in this picture, that's a real single point scope. Even though it has the front piece broke off, the front glass lens broken off, it's still an original scope, unlike the Empire Strikes Back. Moving down to the scope mount, you'll notice the scope mount is also very similar to the Empire Strikes version, but it's missing the front sight. And this is actually the first DH-17 that does not have the front sight incorporated into the scope mount. You'll also see that they've machined in some dovetail recesses to mount the scope, and they're using real scope mounts, but they're not the same style that they used in the two previous versions. This is a different style scope mount or scope ring. These are the real deal. They have the thumb screws, they're mounted the way they should be to the scope mount. You'll also notice there are two little holes, one in the front and one under the scope, back by the rear sight. And that is how the scope mount is mounted to the body of the blaster. Moving on to Greeblies, we have the similar 6 Greeblies that we had on the ESB. We have 5 on the left side and 1 on the right, except for, if you notice very closely, these are actually rivets. Some of them are spaced a little bit higher with some washers in between them. And there's a good possibility these rivets are also holding in the filler panel that is being used to fill in the charging lever slot on the receiver tube. And if you notice very quickly also, it's the same type of plastic that was used for the cover plate that covers up where the folding stock used to be. Moving down, we also have 2 Revell engine halves, just like on the ESB. Part numbers 67 and 68 from the visible engine kit. They're held on by flathead screws. Now, we didn't mention what held on the versions in the Empire Strikes Back because it didn't look like there was anything there. I think some had something that looked like maybe a Phillips head screw on a couple of them, but most of them actually were just holes they must have been glued on. Also, we don't have the crankshaft parts that we had on the Empire Strikes Back, but we have 2 springs, one on the left and one on the right, that fill that same area that's in that same place. The 4 squares. We have 2 large squares on top of the magazine well, and then we have 2 smaller squares on the left and right-hand side of the rear sight. And for the most part, the Greeblies, minus the 2 mystery Greeblies, we don't know what they were on the ESB, and the little missile part, the Greeblies are pretty much the same as on the ESB version. Now, the barrel is also like the ESB and A New Hope. It is obviously inspired by the BSA submachine gun trials gun. You'll also notice the barrel is a little bit longer. You'll see how it goes up inside the receiver tube and actually meets right up against the bolt. You'll also notice there are 2 sheet metal style screws holding it in, and I think the 3rd screw holding it in is actually coming down from the top for the scope mount. And that is the DH-17, the Return of the Jedi DH-17. And obviously you can tell that this is the most refined version of the DH-17. And I hope you enjoyed following along while we dissect this blaster, pull it all apart, and identify all of its parts. Join us next time.